Hello and welcome to another episode of the Coffee and Podcast. We are on a quest to cultivate freedom for victims of human trafficking, all while drinking really great coffee. I'm your host, Philip Klayman. I'm also one of the co-founders of Three Tree Coffee in Statesboro, Georgia. And on today's show, we have Phil Gazley here, who's the program director in England for Peace Catalyst Norwich. He has pioneered anti-trafficking education for the past 20 years, and he has extensive experience with refugee resettlement and relief. During this episode, these two worlds are going to collide. We're going to discuss many different types of vulnerable populations, specifically the refugee population, and how this ties into human trafficking and the anti-trafficking movement. I want to give a quick warning that we talk about more sensitive topics in episodes like this, and any episodes that are titled Coffee and Fill in the Blank. And so we just encourage listener discretion and that you're ready to listen to heavier topics like anti-trafficking and refugee resettlement. With that said, let's go ahead and dive in. Phil, thank you so much for being on the show today. Let's start with you. Tell us a little bit more about you and your background.
Well, I think probably the first thing is to apologize for my accent because I come from England and I've been back in England for about 6 years now, close to 6 years. But obviously my wife is American and my kids still live in the United States, and I lived in Canada and the United States for 27 years. So when I used to do public speaking in the States, I used to joke that I drink coffee with half and half.
A little bit of both accents in there, right?
Because it's, hopefully you won't need subtitles. I was born in the county of Essex in England, and that's where I grew up. And and I grew up in a way that was a pretty normal sports fanatic kid, really. And but there was always something in me that kind of had a sense of injustice, even as a young person. I remember standing up about 12 years old doing a fundraiser for Save the Children Fund. And when apartheid was going on in South Africa, I would put, this might sound kind of strange, but my way of kind of mentally fighting that in my head was to make my sandwiches with brown and white bread deliberately with one side of each, so that I was remembering the sadness of apartheid in my school sack lunches. So, yeah, there's always been something wired in me that kind of a way, you know. And I was one of these people. I got a place in business college when I was 16 years old. I'm 62 years old. So back then in England, you left school at 16 and you either went on to college and university or you went to work. And I came from a working class kind of culture where you went to work. So that's what I did. And so my kind of life has been very eclectic. It's been very out of the box in terms of the things I've been able to do. And I'm deeply privileged, you know, and so blessed with the opportunities and the things that we've had in our life, working over 30 countries and having a wonderful family, and also getting to work in an academic world when I don't come from an academic background. So educationally, I really did leave school at 16. Now, I did do some studies in Bible school, and I actually ended up being ordained eventually. But it's a very odd journey, and I ended up working with several universities over the years, and which I thoroughly have enjoyed. But I would often join the work there in terms of research and other projects I work in, saying, "Why am I here?" kind of a thing. And but thoroughly enjoyed those experiences. Yeah.
Nice. Well, so we've had many people on the podcast, and I've actually, you mentioning this is making me realize a consistent theme. A lot of people kind of had this, what you just said, almost this thirst for justice from a young age. It's like something in them just kind of gripped them about injustices in the world or things that didn't seem right. And I guess my question to you would be, do you feel like your parents cultivated that? Were they the same way? Or do you think it was literally just something you were born with, some gene that you got that gave you that passion? What would you say to that?
Unfortunately, I honestly don't know. I mean, my parents, my mother's still alive. We lost my dad a few years ago, and my parents were wonderful, and I grew up in a wonderful family. But I think if my mum watched this, she would laugh because I would probably say that both of them kind of wondered where I came from in a way, in terms of not being kind of fitting in a sense. So yeah, that would be my answer to that, really.
Okay, not a problem. So something about it was in the genes,
Yeah,
or just a
yes,
passion
it's
you
there
had.
somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then you mentioned you kind of got involved in academic work. What was the extent of that academic work? Were you researching specifically refugees, anti-trafficking movement, or other things? Kind of what was the work you were focused on during the academic time?
Um, well, it started out with because I had a conversion experience to Christianity when I was 21 years old. And so a lot of my work initially was tied into ministry. So it was studying church growth and church history and theology and things like that, which I still love very much in terms of reading and study. But that evolved into the work that I did at the running a campus ministry at the University of Calgary, where we were doing Bible studies and things with faculty and things like that. I then got to work for 2.5 years on a project with the University of Alabama, Birmingham, where we were training social workers to do work with volunteers to actually assist people with AIDS from the AIDS clinic there. And that turned into a program working with refugees that maybe I can pick up on a bit later. And then lastly, I guess, was I worked with the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking as a research assistant for 3 years on a project that they have called the Colorado Project. And if you go to lcht.org, you can check that out. It's a really, really great work. And the people there, I can't say enough about the great work they do. So, yeah, and that was tied into, some of that work was tied into Metro State in Colorado as well. So, yeah, there's some connection with that within the research work, I suppose. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And then I think I heard you mention earlier before we were filming that you were in a band at some point. Is that correct?
Yeah. I was a bass player in my young days and used to play. I played in several bands that toured across Europe, and I don't know. You might have heard the musician's joke. That's what's the difference between a musician and a savings bond, and the answer is one eventually matures and makes money. A band I was in split up, and I was running out of money. So I joined something that people in Georgia are going to think this is hilarious. It was a British band that was a country rock band of all British people.
Oh, man. What was the name of the band? Can we find this online?
It was not very easily. Okay. It's pretty obscure. The band was called Chester. It was named after Chet Atkins, actually. And I actually didn't like a lot of that kind of music, but I grew to love it in the tour that we did, especially the country rock side of things. And that was where I had my conversion experience in terms of faith, touring across Canada with that band. So, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's kind of ironic because I actually played bass as well. I played stand-up bass growing up.
Oh, really?
My dad was a traveling musician, and he ended up stopping as well, probably because of like you said, the bonds didn't mature. Wasn't making enough money, had to move on to something else. But I just find it ironic. We have two Phillips here on the interview that both played bass. So we'll have to talk about that another time.
Right.
Nice.
That's great.
Okay. Well, so, it seems like your work primarily started with refugees. And even as you're sharing some more, it seems like it more so started with ministry, then kind of social services, morphing into refugees. But specifically, I know you did some work with Lutheran Family Services. Tell us more about what draws you to working with the refugee population. You have this heart for injustice from a young age, but something in you seemed to say, this is the population I want to focus on. What drew you to that?
Well, my original story in terms of working with refugees wasn't that particularly spectacular in that I originally moved to Denver, Colorado to work with a church. And without going into, there's a long story there, but things weren't kind of working out with that the way that we'd expected. And so I needed to find a job. And I saw this job working with a refugee resettlement agency and applied and got the job. And it's one of the best things I ever did in my life, because from that came this incredible experience of working in an environment that is just this just beautiful representation of just the unity of humanity, in terms of people from different faiths and people from different backgrounds working together to serve the various refugee populations in the city. And yeah, it's an experience that is very, very special to me.
Wow. So then, we talk about how refugees are a vulnerable population. And on this
Yeah,
podcast, we've had other people on that have talked about various vulnerable populations. And when they're a vulnerable population, they can be at risk for human trafficking and things like this. Why are refugees such a vulnerable group of people? I'd love to hear your perspective, having worked with so many. Why are they a vulnerable group?
I think the first thing in talking about refugees is that we have to think about listening to there's kind of two dynamics of listening to stories. One of them is the stories of the individual, and the other one is the story of the population. The story of the population within the populations of refugees around the world is very, very different. There's commonalities in terms of the fact that, a refugee by definition is somebody that has had to flee their homeland as a result of things including race, religion, war, persecution, political reasons, and natural disasters. So there's that commonality within that. But at the same time, the political situation, the poverty situation, the situation in relation to war, the situation in regard to famine, climate change dynamics, things like that can all play into those things. Obviously we see a lot more climate refugees now than we would have done years ago as well. So I think that's the first thing, is that we need to listen first, I think, is the big thing in this. And so refugees are vulnerable because they're people that have had to flee their homeland and come into a situation that is particularly challenging. So if you think of it, let's just imagine for a minute someone in Statesboro is going on a holiday to Europe. Sorry, that's the English word, holiday, vacation, as you would say. Do some translating here as we go along. But let's just imagine somebody, and I'm sure there's plenty of people from Statesboro that have had a vacation in Europe somewhere. Well, when you get off the plane, it's a little bit disconcerting, isn't it? Because you've got a different language, you've got different currency, you've got different ways of thinking in terms of how you might ask somebody a question. I always think about that. What is it? Oh, the old Indiana Jones movie, where with Dan Amelia, where Harrison Ford says Marcus is just going to fit in like nobody can see him, and you've got this British guy like, hello, can you hear me? Kind of, I think it's hilarious. Well, that's kind of how it is, right? When we're in a place that we don't know. Well, imagine being in a place where that you don't know, where you have a different language, you have a different culture, but you're also in a place where you've suffered deep trauma. You're in a place of grief and loss. And you're in a place where the structure of how you get help means constantly waiting for absolutely everything. Mm. And, so the combination of all of these different things and people's experiences, people that have lost children to starvation getting to a refugee camp, people that have missing family where they've fled a country and don't know where their other family members are, people that have fled a country and been picked up by traffickers and fallen into and been forced and coerced into trafficking situations. So all of these things are a part of why refugees are particularly vulnerable, both around the world and for those that arrive into the United States through the refugee resettlement program and other kinds of ways as well. So there's a huge vulnerability there.
Mm.
The other thing I'd just say, sorry, do you want me to?
No, continue. Yeah, please.
Should I keep going? Sorry. I think the other thing is that within that vulnerability, there's a huge amount of misunderstanding. And what I've tried to say to people about the overall picture of immigration over the years is that the most important thing we can do is actually get to know people. If we're judging from a distance, if we're in a place where we think, oh, those people shouldn't be here, and get to know and listen to the stories, get to know different populations, learn about their stories and their journeys. There was a wonderful man in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, who actually used to do a radio show where he would interview immigrants, and it was called Immigrant Stories. And it was one of the most powerful things. It's very much like what you're doing with this podcast in terms of, and he would have different immigrant populations from the local community come and share their stories on the radio, on his radio show. And the influence of that was phenomenal. And so I think there's this thing of getting to know people that is a really important part of this, and the education side of it as well. I mean, there was 117 million displaced people in the world last year in 2023, according to UNHCR.
117
the United
million.
Nations
Wow.
Refugee.
Yeah.
117 million. Only 1.1 million of that number were able to go home.
Wow.
You see, that puts it in perspective in terms of how we think about migration dynamics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I love how you kind of put us in their shoes for a minute. Imagine you're displaced from your home, and at a minimum, you have these cultural barriers, is what was one of the things I'm hearing you say. And I remember I actually was traveling to Indonesia a few years back, and my wife and I ended up stopping in Tokyo for a day. We were flying in one airport and out of another airport. And we ended up getting lost in the largest city in the world, which was absolutely terrifying, right? Because the subway system is just a web, and everything's characters. It's not even the phonetical alphabet. And so when you're sharing about those cultural differences and the language differences, and it's overwhelming, right? You're just trying to figure out, how do I even get a meal? How do I figure out where I'm supposed to go? I don't even know where to eat first. Where's a bank? I don't know what anything is. It all looks different. It sounds different. It feels different. So for refugees, there's these cultural barriers, but even deeper than that, you seem to be touching on, they've all gone through some sort of trauma. And it may be very personal, like the loss of a child, or it may be even kind of more populist, right? Where it's like their whole political system maybe has unraveled, or there's a lot of corruption that they're fleeing. So, I mean, it's very eye-opening to hear you share about all the different ways that people may be experiencing trauma and are therefore very vulnerable, coming to this new place that they're not familiar with.
And also to go along with that, I mean, you also have, in terms of grief and loss, the idea of why me, in terms of, just as we have in disaster situations, in war situations as well. There's this horrible trauma dynamic of somebody else having died and somebody being shot next to you, like in tragedies like the war in Bosnia, for example, and even with the horrors of what's going on in Gaza right now. There's this thing where you might come out of a situation and there's a lot of trauma in terms of that question of why am I still alive when somebody else isn't, whether that be a family member, a friend, or maybe someone that you don't even know. So that's another aspect consideration as well in that.
Absolutely. Now, do most refugees flee? I imagine, I would think the most common reason for a refugee to flee home country would be war, but you mentioned a lot of others. Is it most commonly war, or is it actually usually other means as to why people are fleeing?
Well, in terms of numbers, I couldn't really give you an answer to that right now, because I think that Palestinians has been the largest number of refugees in the world, generally speaking, for a lot of years. But because they're kind of regarded as a separate population to the refugee world in some respects, that hasn't often been considered. Last year, the numbers of people fleeing between Palestine and Myanmar was similar. Myanmar was a country that a lot of people fled from as well. Um, so, um, so yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that's really important in this is that when we use the term refugees, that in and of itself is a question and an issue, because the word refugee is used in different countries in different ways. And you also have people that are asylum seekers. You also have people that we call IDPs, which are internally displaced people. And the majority of people that have actually had to flee their homes are still within the countries where they live, but in horrific situations. So that's what an internally displaced person is. And internally displaced people are particularly vulnerable because obviously it's a lot harder to access where they are in terms of getting help. So the war of what's happening in Gaza and the situation in Sudan right now, Myanmar, I mentioned, there's still horrendous things going on in Yemen as well. So, so these are all places where there's a particular vulnerability in terms of people that are internally displaced. Then you have people that are stateless. I think it's between 2 and 3 million people that are stateless at the moment in the world. I'm not very up on the stats for that, so that's an approximation. But and those are people that have ended up being stuck in a country without any kind of ID or any kind of birth certificate or proof of who they are, where they can't access any kind of benefits and are considered illegal in the country, because and that's a horrendous situation to be in. And different countries handle that in different ways as well. And then, of course, you have trafficking victims. And then you have people that would be considered more economic migrants, which are people that are moving from one place to another for a better job, but still have a cultural dynamic of having some vulnerability because of the cultural difference. And we have more migration in the world right now than any other time in human history. So this whole issue of these created vulnerabilities combined with the migration dynamics that go on is a really interesting thing. And some of it can be horrendous, and some of it can actually also be a joyful connection as well. The fact that you've got different places in the world that have surprising populations, like Sao Paulo, Brazil. Over 5 million Japanese people live in Sao Paulo, Brazil. You've got Fremont, California, with the large Afghan community there, the large Somali community in Minneapolis. You've got these different places that have these populations that different cities and different places have connected to as well. So there's a migration dynamic aspect to it, as well as the aspect of specifically. So we kind of need to widen the net of just refugees in a sense, because so that often is viewed as a very specific category of people within all of those other kind of different names that I gave.
Absolutely. They can look so different. I remember we actually had someone named Lucy McCrae on the podcast from Freedom Story. They're out of Thailand. And one of the primary forms of trafficking that she discussed was kind of what you mentioned. I think you called it stateless people, right? Where they would be trafficked across borders and therefore are now illegal immigrants, right? And they're almost stuck in no man's land. They don't belong in the country they're in, but they don't belong in the country they came from anymore either. And it's a big issue. And I remember that was very eye-opening hearing that from her. You're talking about widening the net. There's a lot of different types of refugees and refugee situations. You mentioned one that I want to unpack and hear a little bit more about. You mentioned climate refugees. What is a climate refugee?
As somebody that's basically had to move out of their country or out of their situation because of a natural disaster, which obviously in different parts of the world. And again, I realize there's a lot of different opinions about climate and all of that. And I didn't mean to get into that as a subject because I'm no expert on that at all. So, but the reason I bring it up is because there has been this observation of larger numbers of certain types of disasters that has created an environment for people to flee their homes. And there's been vulnerability to trafficking as a result of that in certain situations. I mean, even in even with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, there was some things in related to vulnerability to trafficking in that. I actually worked with people that are resettled in Colorado from that, in a whole separate project. But there's obviously vulnerability with the dynamics. That would be an example of that. But that's also happened in other countries on big scales as well. Where there's higher levels of vulnerability. So so that's kind of what I mean by that.
Absolutely. Well, and then my next question with just refugees and immigration, you brought up immigration, and it seems like that's such a touchy, highly politicized concept. And I would say in a sad way that it almost immediately triggers. It seems like in a lot of people, I either think this way or I think this way, and it feels very dehumanizing and it feels very tense. Do you agree with that experience? And why do you think that is? Why do you think this is such a intense subject to talk about when it's an important subject to talk about?
Well, it's a different issue in different countries. There are some similarities. I think that a lot of it is rooted in fear. And I think a lot of it is also rooted in rhetoric that isn't necessarily accurate in terms of the reality of what's taking place. So, for example, the refugee resettlement program in the United States, which has been around, with government funding and recognized agencies since the it started in the mid 70s, really, in terms of its really early days, and evolved and developed from there. But that program, having seen programs in other countries, I think that program has a lot of good to it within its problems and its issues. And having that number of around 120,000 a year in the appropriations for that refugee program means there is something set that experienced people and experienced agencies can work in together in a way where there's community connection, there's faith connection, there's respect of faith within different faith backgrounds of where people are coming from. And that organization can then connect to third-party organizations that are more grassroots in the community to make good and healthy connection with those populations for a wider integration in the community. So what America does well in refugee resettlement is it does a pretty good job of integration. What it doesn't do such a good job of is helping people find jobs and getting people economically set up. So, you have a very limited amount of time that before you have to find a job compared to other countries and being resettled as a refugee in the United States. And also the United States tends not to recognize qualifications that are valid from other countries for work. So, so I used to work with people from, Sudan specifically comes to mind in terms of people that were qualified doctors, that highly qualified doctors that weren't able to practice here and had to go back to school to redo over again the same things that they already knew.
Wow.
I remember sitting with an Iraqi woman who was just crying and with tears sitting next to me in our office because she was a highly qualified dentist who had to work in a store because we couldn't find any other job for her while within the pressure of the timeline, and she would have to requalify even though she was highly qualified in what she did, and she was just brokenhearted over that. So there are things we can advocate for, in terms of why can't people that come actually have those qualifications recognized with a limited amount of training that's needed for the cultural dynamics so that they can enter into the place especially when there's a shortage of healthcare workers around the world right now, So that would be an example of that. I think the biggest thing we can do is take that bold step, which for some people is bold and for others it isn't, but is to get to know people and to listen to what their stories are and then base things on that in terms of building relationship and building friendship. And I think that's the most important thing we can do. And we can advocate in terms of policy. We can have different opinions about that. But but let's live and work with what's around us. Let's learn what's in our communities. And it's not necessarily big cities. I mean, Greeley, Colorado, for example, we worked with a Somali community there that was working in meatpacking factories out more in the countryside. And so you've got populations in different places that you can learn and connect to and have the joy of getting to know the stories and the journeys of different people from around the world. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing that we can do more than anything else.
Yeah, well, I think that's incredible wisdom that you're sharing, and that, a lot of this is built out of fear. And it's probably fear based off assumptions, not actual facts or conversation, or, it's just, it's kind of, and I do this, we all do this, we blow up fear in our head. It's those fear makes things something that it's almost not sometimes, right? Where we can just get so worked up about something. And so what you're saying is, get to know someone, hear a little bit more about their story.
Exactly.
Let's humanize this a little bit. And it just helps lower the barriers for both the refugee and for us to kind of accept, okay, what's the world we live in? And then how do we address it to see people blessed, to see people taken care of? I think that's incredibly profound. So I appreciate you sharing that. All right. So, this podcast is all about ending human trafficking. That's why we started this podcast. That's why we started this coffee business. And we've been talking primarily about refugees. And, I'll go and be honest. I've always kind of seen it as a different category of social issues. And I'm sure there's arguments that could be made for that. But you seem to really address these more together. And so I'd love to hear, where do you see human trafficking and refugee resettlement connecting in its issues and its solutions? How do you see these two reconciling together?
Well, the first thing on that is that how I got involved in this in the first place was working with a refugee resettlement agency when the 2000 Trafficking Victim Protection Act came in 2000. Part of the deal of that was that refugee resettlement agencies would take some of their funding and use it to provide services for people that were victims of labor trafficking specifically. And so there's a way in which it became a part of our job. And I was building volunteer teams to work with refugee families especially. And I was the church relations coordinator, so I was developing relationships with different faith communities as well within that work. And so I was asked to raise awareness about human trafficking at the beginning of my work in the job. I started in 2000 when this all happened. That's when I started there. So I started out that way, really. And that's why I've always had a real important interest in raising awareness and being productive about labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking and the intersection between the two things there as well. Because obviously there's an intersection that way too. So the intersectionality of these things, I think, is really, really key because it is easy to separate out. And one of the things that we figured out even through the research, where did I get worship from? That was interesting.
That's right.
That was strange. Was the need for prevention programs in relation to refugee populations. So we actually took prevention material that we had and had it translated into some different languages and then got some advice about the use of that program in different populations. So I found myself in Denver, Colorado, for example, doing trafficking awareness with Burmese refugees in Denver, Colorado. And so how does that relate to your community? If you're watching this, how does this relate to, the key thing is to not make assumptions about where needs are, but to work with the community and to work with the people in the community to ask questions and not just to dive in and do stuff. One, without permissions, and secondly, with the listening of what the situations are of where people are actually seeing themselves as vulnerable rather than the assumptions of our vulnerability, which, I may have done some of that in this chat here even, but we really, this is where building relationships and getting involved in people's lives in this is such a key thing.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there's a lot of overlap. Like most things in life, everything's a little more connected than I think we like to give it credit for. And you're even saying, I mean, it started out as refugee work, but naturally you're having situations of human trafficking come up, specifically labor trafficking, but not excluding sex trafficking as well. And where you have vulnerable peoples, you have exploitation. And something needs to be done about it. You wrote a really great article for Love 146. This is a website or organization that people can check out, Love 146. And we'll put a link to this in the show notes as well. And you were giving advice on how to engage human trafficking prevention among refugees. So the very work that you just were talking about, I would like to read just a couple of those points for our listeners. And I would love to have you just expound as to why you recommend these practices. So one of the things you mentioned was that you encourage, when we're talking about engaging human trafficking prevention among refugees, do all work in partnership with a local refugee resettlement agency. So why do you recommend that?
Yes. Again, there are exceptions to the rule. These are only principles. And I want to say that because I think that's important. There are people that will have bad experiences of working with refugee resettlement agencies, just as they could with anything else. So I'm not hiding away from that. But in principle, I think the idea, generally speaking, of working with refugees through the recognized agencies that are in the government-funded programs is a good way to connect and start, and then connect to maybe other organizations that are grassroots in the community from that. And that's because these agencies have the primary responsibility. I mean, in England, we would use almost a language like in the safeguarding work I do in England, we call it a statutory duty of care. It's something akin to that in terms of, there's a responsibility. They're being held accountable with money to actually help these populations in a set program in terms of cultural connection, in terms of housing, in terms of employment, in terms of getting kids registered in school, in terms of healthcare, and all of the issues concerned with the healthcare program. So there are caseworkers and employment specialists that are working already on the ground doing those things. So connecting to that, I think, is just a logical first step in terms of how you connect. And you might find yourself doing other things from that might not, you look for where the gaps are, see where the strengths are, look for where the gaps are. So there might be a women's empowerment program that could be needed, that could be really, really important for that community. There could be some educational things in terms of maybe apprenticeships for certain types of jobs that might be helpful. There might be funding that can be given to help a highly qualified person that I was talking about get back into employment in that profession that they may have had. College assistance, for example, can sometimes, that's usually further down the road. But usually the first thing is language assistance in terms of English, and it's employment, and it's building connection in the community. Those are, and obviously the healthcare and the things I just mentioned. So those are the basics. But after that, can be ongoing connection for other things too. So that's why I generally advocate for that.
Excellent. Sounds like there's lots of benefits to that. First, kind of pioneering it solo and jumping right in and things like that. Okay.
Yeah.
So then the next practice that you recommend would be pay professional translators and be sure that you can trust them. Why do you recommend that?
Oh, boy. Yeah. and this is really, some of this is from, and like, I'll just share a story with you. I took a client to a hospital one time with a child, and they used a telephone translation service where I only found out afterwards that the person that was there, the adult with the child, was just being nice and nodding to different things when actually the person came from the country that was described. but it was the wrong language from the country of origin that they came from.
So the language was close, but not all the way there.
It actually wasn't even close.
Wasn't even close.
Wasn't even close. It was a different language.
Oh, wow.
And so there's a lot of kind of due diligence in some of these areas. And I think there's something about, and again, this is for certain things, you know, relationally, there's always going to be some things where, for example, children will learn English faster than their parents do because of learning it in school. And there's going to be things where children are going to translate for their parents. Those things are inevitable. So when I brought this up, it was more to do with kind of serious matters and things like the wider picture of healthcare, or, you know, things like that are more formal things than relational things. I don't mean it for every single thing or in the community. It was more to do with the formalized translation needs rather than the informal, I guess, would be the way of putting that.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So then the third one, we'll do 4 of these. The third one, a practice that you recommended when doing human trafficking prevention among refugees, is design materials for the specific population you are addressing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing about, you know, it's interesting how thinking about the intersection with refugees and human trafficking specifically, and the vulnerabilities of that and the sadness of the things that can happen. You know, I've always worked with, you've probably heard the Palermo Protocol mentioned a lot, I'm guessing, by people in your talks, you know, but, you know, prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. You know, and so I've always, you know, when I was leading the Kern Coalition in California, we worked with that 4P principle, and now we had different committees set up for those 4Ps, and that's how we function in terms of having what we desire to have as a comprehensive approach to anti-trafficking efforts. And so the prevention aspect of it, and this was one of the things that came up in the Colorado project and was involved in the research, was that prevention tended to be something that was preaching to the choir at that time. I'm going back over 10 years now, and I think it's really improved a lot over the last 10 years. But it wasn't something that was being, one, specifically in terms of audiences, but also identifying the specific needs for prevention communication in vulnerable communities. And so I think that those things have improved, and especially when it comes to work in schools. I did a ton of prevention work in schools in California, and amongst other populations as well. And so, yeah, design your program. Don't just take something off the internet and take a template. You know, it's more than that. The other thing is the M&E from it as well. You know, the monitoring and evaluation is get evaluation about your prevention efforts, get input into it. You know, one of the things I loved about the support team network at UAB was this constant thriving to improve the programs and the things that we were working. And I think prevention work has to have that. It can't be something where we just walk in. It's something that there's follow-up and there's work that goes along with it. So I think that's another really key part of prevention work generally.
Yeah, you know, this one, some of what you're saying almost makes me think of marketing in the business world. Kind of marketing 101 is know your audience and make sure you speak specifically to that audience.
Yeah.
Because the more general and broad-based you are, the less likely you are to succeed. So as an example, if someone came to me and said, hey, I do consulting for businesses, I'd be like, okay. But then if they said, I do consulting for coffee businesses, I'd be like, ooh, I'm more interested. And then if they say, I do consulting for coffee businesses for people named Phil who also play bass, you know, now I'm like, whoa, you're talking directly to me. I'm now a lot more engaged. Fascinating. Love what you're sharing here. Okay. And then the last one, the fourth point, well, you recommend 10. So I encourage all of our listeners to go look up this article. We'll link it in the show notes. But the other one I want to address in this podcast is serve culturally relevant food and drinks. Why do you recommend that?
Oh my gosh. Well, and the thing about that is, and that kind of that is important, but it's also important to listen to what people are interested in trying in terms of food, in terms of, so if we're talking about refugees that are resettled in the United States, again, asking questions in this can be really, really important. So a lot of people have learned the hard way years ago that canned food was not something that was popular to give people, for example, among some refugee communities. And there were people that would make a chicken stew for a population of people that were vegetarian, thinking about halal, thinking about kosher, things like that as well. So you've got all of those things within that. So there has to be, again, this listening process of thinking about what people want. One example I'll give you of that is just real quick. This isn't actually a refugee story, but the principle's the same. Going back to the support team network at UAB, my boss in that project back then got a phone call from one of the clients who was a volunteer team was going over to his house. The man was very, very sick, and they were going to his house to clean it and just help him and bring him a meal every now and then. And he called to the guy that was my boss and said, I love this team and they're wonderful people and I really look forward to when they come over. But the only problem is that every Monday when they come over, they bring green bean casserole. And I hate green bean casserole. And my boss colleague said, don't worry, I'll get onto it. So we actually, from that, in our trainings with workers, we actually called it the green bean casserole rule. So follow the green bean casserole rule, So and think about that. But yes, connecting, food is such an important connection with people. There is a joy. And the other thing is that, again, because we're thinking of people that are in places of vulnerability, it doesn't mean that the families and the people that you might have been doing certain things to help are, people want to bless you. This is always reciprocal. So, sometimes it can be very humbling to receive an incredible meal from people you're thinking, how are they managing to do this? And it might have been a struggle, but you embrace that, you accept that, you enjoy it, and you make it a part of the joy of the connection with the families and the people that you're a part of. So I think that's the big thing about that. And obviously sometimes that can be on a wider community level or community events with certain populations. That's an absolute joy to be a part of that. But even receiving from people that you're working with is a very important thing, I think.
Wonderful. Well, love the advice. Once again, encourage all of our listeners to go look up that Love 146 article that will be in the show notes. So now let's bring up to your current job, the work that you do. You're currently with Peace Catalyst International, specifically the program manager, program director of Peace Catalyst Norwich. And the mission of this organization is to equip and mobilize Christians for collaborative peace building. Tell us more about this organization and what led you there.
Well, what led me there was I think looking back on the work of trafficking that we did in California, especially with labor trafficking victims, many of which were immigrants and asylum seekers and some refugees as well. There was something from those populations that particularly touched me in terms of the question of people feeling safe in their communities. And then I also did some work with the local government department in terms of young people that were vulnerable adults and young people in juvie. And and a lot of the foster homes tended to be in one part of the city that I was working in at the time. And it made me begin to think a lot about community safety. And then a wonderful book called The Locust Effect by Gary Hagan, who was the guy that started IJM. He talks in one part of a book that he wrote, this book, The Locust Effect. he brings up some stories about how he would sit with people and ask them questions about what was important to them for the needs of their community. And basically, what came out of that, from the way I understood and read it, was that, a lot of people think about clean water, they think about food, they think about education, they think about micro business. But what he found when he asked the question, what's the thing that's most important thing about your community? The most common answer back was, I want to feel safe. And how much do we think about safety? Because if we want to, and I just want to be open and honest with you, because I think this might be interesting for you, is I don't use language of ending human trafficking. I use language of combating it. Because I think the idea of ending it, I mean, I don't want to sound faithless, but this side of eternity, I just don't know. I mean, you have organizations where it's like, I want to end human trafficking in my city. Well, my experience is that the problem goes elsewhere. You might have solved the problem for yourself, but you haven't solved it for someone else. So I'm just being honest about that in terms of my experience. I'm not saying that's valid at all, but in terms of combating human trafficking in a general sense, I realized that, man, one of the keys to this is developing safe communities. And to do that, we need people that can come together from different communities, different backgrounds, different faiths, to actually cross lines of difference, to be able to listen to each other. And I've used that word listen a lot in this, but I want to use two other L's as well. And this is language that I personally use. The language in PCI, we talk about understanding and connecting and collaborating. For this time, I'm framing that as listen and learning and loving. You see, and I want to suggest that as we bring people together, first and foremost to listen from different situations and different backgrounds, we can begin to foster a sense of being a safe place. And if we're fostering safe places for people, then we're doing something that's a real commitment to the common good that can build places where it's not just a case of being aware of what to look for in terms of human trafficking, which is massively important, but it's also about creating environments where people feel safe, which is why I work in safeguarding and why what my life, I think, will probably be at my age until I'm done, is to be a part of this movement through being a peace builder and being somebody that actually brings people together. I had a great relationship with a mosque that is actually next door to my church. And I've got to know one of the leaders there in particular, and some of our conversations are just delightful because we find within the differences that we might have, we find so much common ground in our stories about the things that we have in life and even the things we have in faith to some degree as well. And that's built a connection that can be a positive impact for the people within that wider community, or the parish, as we would call it in the church world here. So that's kind of where I lie now, is seeking to help, to love, and to listen, and then to learn, ask questions and learn about what's going on, learn about where the issues are. And then the loving is the implementation. It's how do you go about actually putting these things into practice within the community? And so that's a lot of where my life is now, specifically in terms of helping interfaith groups and churches, kind of how they can come together and actually be committed to the common good as a part of faith, to be able to make a difference in that way, which I know for some Christians listening might sound strange, but if I could do one Christianese thing just for 1 second, if that's okay. There's a story that's recognized by all it's in the book of Jeremiah, so it's recognized by Jews and Muslims as well as Christians, where it says, seek the peace of the city. And the that, we know as shalom has this much wider meaning, which is actually seek the welfare. So it's actually seeking the common good of your city, and this is a command for all three of those faiths. It's a command from God to seek the welfare of the city. So as Christians, as well as other faiths, we have this thing where to bring the shalom of the city is to bring not just what we think of as peace, but also the welfare and the best interest, for the people in the places where we live in terms of how we develop that. So I think that's not necessarily as Christianese as you might think. I think that relates to all of us, doesn't it, in terms of how it is. But it is something that from a faith angle, people have found helpful. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and to do that, as you said, you got to listen, learn, and love. And in that, you really start to find common ground. You'd almost think, what do I have in common with someone who's fleeing a war-torn country? Well, maybe you don't like green beans, right?
There you go.
Maybe you have a certain same amount of kids. Maybe you like similar food, or or maybe you have been through similar trauma. When you can start to listen and really find those commonalities, you can really truly then to learn and love. So, Phil, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for just sharing so much of your experience and your wisdom on your work with refugees. You're working in the anti-trafficking space. You're working in the peace-making space. So just thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in as you do week in and week out. I want to remind you that we donate $1 of every bag to ending human trafficking. So we thank you so much for those who support that and are purchasing our product. And then next week on this podcast, we're going to be diving into the world of tea with Megan Miller. She's with the CEO of Hale Tea Company out of Savannah, Georgia. But until then, I'm your host, Philip Klayman, and thank you so much for helping us cultivate freedom.